in collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up this week, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs visits Cyprus and talks to members of civil society.
But mainly to listen from you, how you see things going and moving in this time.
3 teams have been chosen to represent Cyprus at the European finals of the Climate Launchpad.
So you need both the market but also the technical innovation behind it. And teams, with the help of Climate Kick, will transform it into a viable product.
The mayor of Famagusta expects some movement on the occupied town.
We should not expect to press a button and return to our town. That will take time for reconstruction. So people should not confuse movement of Famagusta, which will be the beginning of the end, and starting again a new town, which will take time.
And Cyprus has improved its record on human trafficking, but there's still a long way to go.
These are women and men who are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, and not only that, have gone through extremely traumatic experiences.
Last week, the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, came to Cyprus and began her day of contacts by spending an hour with representatives of civil society organisations in Cyprus. She wanted the grassroots feeling of what was happening on the island before she started meeting with the leaders.
I asked to start my visit with a meeting with you. This is something I always do in my visits, everywhere I go, meeting with civil society organizations, NGOs, youth movements, I understand it's present also. And here it's even more valuable for me to start with this meeting, to get from you the sense of your work and of, I would say, the mood of the society you're working with and living in. And in particular here, I know of the commitment and of the extremely valuable work you're doing to put the divisions behind and to promote reconciliation. And to me, as we don't have much time, this is not really time for making speeches. I'm sorry, I hope you will not be disappointed, but mainly to listen from you, how you see things going and moving in this time. That seeing from Brussels, but also from the rest of Europe and also from the rest of the world, I have to say, is a time of hope for the island. So for me this is a great chance to understand and to listen from you. How do you see life on the island in this particular time, and your work in this respect, and our support to your work. What is more useful to do, what is less useful to do, and what do you think are the perspectives. But really, in general terms, the mood of the island in this moment, that would be the great added value I would get from this exchange, hoping that this can be also useful for you. But I have to admit, my guess is that this meeting will be extremely fruitful and useful for me, because it's really a listening mode, the one I'm starting with this morning. So I'm not sure these were opening remarks, but that explains a little bit what I would like to have from this 40 minutes we have in front of us. So it's really, for me, listening, understanding, maybe asking some questions and learn a lot from you. Thank you.
The EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Federica Mogherini, talking to civil society in Cyprus last week.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Monday night saw hordes of people gathering in Nicosia for the Climate Launchpad 2015. The winners of the Cyprus competition will be going to the European finals in Amsterdam later this year. And joining us from the organisers' Chrysalis Leap are Alexandros Charalambidis and Paris Thoma. Paris, start off, if you will, by telling us exactly what it was that you organised as Chrysalis Leap, because I've spoken about this before, but this is something that you've now taken on board as an annual thing.
Right, it's the second time we're running this. Last year was a pilot with 10 countries participating, and this year was much, much bigger. We had 28 countries across Europe participating in the largest business idea competition regarding clean tech meaning environmental technologies related to sustainable development, and basically any idea that has a climate impact. And so we run this competition for Cyprus and Greece. We being Chrysalis Leap, we're the clean tech accelerator locally based here in Cyprus. And pretty much the competition works like the Eurovision Song Contest. You have the national contests that take approximately 10 teams, train them, and through that training we have the national final, which is what we did here, and we have 3 teams selected that represent that country to the European finals, like you said, in Amsterdam. And that's sort of how the competition works.
Okay, and tell us a bit about the judges, because you had people across from the sponsors of the whole thing as well as people who support entrepreneurship.
That's right. We had 4 judges tonight. One of them was Mr. Evieniu, who is the CEO of PwC and could bring his financial background to the judging panel. We also have Mr. Bird, who is the CEO of Hellenic Bank, one of our other sponsors, and he has vast experience in the whole of spectrum of clean tech before joining the banking industry. Third, we had Ron Bloemers, who is one of the trainers of Climate Kick, who is the organizer of Climate Launchpad, and who also funds startups himself. And he brought the investor side to the team. And last but not least, Stelios, who is one of the founders of Chrysalis Leap, and is also an academic, a professor at the Cyprus University of Technology, and could judge the ideas based on their technical innovation.
A little bit about the 10 finalists. How were they selected? Because only 3 of them, of course, get that ticket to Amsterdam. What happens to the rest?
Right, so we had over 45 teams apply in Cyprus, and we selected the top 10.
How did you select them?
So we're looking at several things. For instance, the innovation, how big the potential of the market is, if it's mature enough for them to know exactly how they're going to roll it out, to what we call the beachhead market. And the beachhead market is a term we use for the first market they're going to attack. A very important criteria is climate impact. Do they actually solve climate change in one way or another? It doesn't have to solve it 100%, but every little piece counts. We were looking at the job and social impact as well of these ideas. So just simply from their application, at the application stage, we selected the 10 teams that we felt had achieved checked those boxes basically the best. And tonight we did the same thing, but obviously you can imagine in the last 3 months the teams have matured tremendously. We've had teams who came to us with an application that just had a pencil drawing, and tonight they put it on stage as an actual prototype. We had teams that spoke to lots and lots of customers. They called overseas and they asked, do you have this pain I'm trying to solve? And that's tremendous because you see the actual progress. And for us, the organizing committee and the trainers, that's the value we receive from this, to see how they've evolved from something mediocre at least to something spectacular this evening.
The one thing that was noticeable during some of the presentations was that these are still very much ideas, and some of the questions from the judging panel highlighted, if you like, the fact that maybe a little bit more thought needs to go into them before they could possibly be marketed.
Yes, exactly. This is an ideas competition, and the point of Climate Kick is to select the best ideas to go into the Climate Kick accelerator. And this accelerator is basically 18 months of schooling and training and mentoring to transform your idea into a business.
But to do that, your idea needs to be workable. It wasn't very clear on a couple of the presentations whether that was the case.
To be honest, it doesn't matter, because even if you have the best idea and you have a prototype and it works and you have 5 patents on it, if you don't have a market and if you don't have a customer, if you're not solving a pain and you just have a very nice product, an academic product with 5 patents, it's not going to sell. So you need both the market but also the technical innovation behind it. And teams, with the help of Climate Kick, will transform it into a viable product.
But to just add to that, you could see that even from the top 3 selected, the feasibility of their idea was very apparent. So it's true what you're saying, that a couple of ideas were still, the jury, they're human. They need a bit of convincing. Can you prove that this dream is possible? And obviously those teams are in a bit of a disadvantage from the point of view of proving that their assumptions are correct. The teams that had, over the course of the training, developed prototypes and actually could, even put it on stage and say, here it is, I know it, it works. obviously had an advantage, and these 3 teams are actually moving into the finals in the European Union.
The rest of the teams, though, can they come back next year and apply again and fine-tune the same ideas, or do next year's people have to come up with something totally different?
No, certainly they can come back not only for next year's competition, but the other thing is we keep in touch with them, and the ones that are really serious about actually bringing their idea into market. There's lots of other opportunities. Cyprus has grown as an ecosystem of entrepreneurship in the last 3 years tremendously. There's lots of initiatives, lots of ways that they can actually receive help. And there's even ways, we call that a wild card, where we can actually help them connect with Climate Kick and still try to enter that accelerator. Because to us, that's sort of the holy grail of clean tech acceleration. When you enter Climate Kick, the world is at your disposal, and the opportunities are tremendous. So,
and we do have business angels here too, don't we?
We do. And in fact, we actually, what we do is we send the teams outside Cyprus to receive that network and those connections and that expertise in terms of the training, but they come back, and then at that point they're ready to pitch to an investor, because at this stage they're at the idea stage. They still have 3 more stages before they're even ready to pitch in front of an investor, and we certainly hope that they'll come back to Cyprus and pitch to our local investors who are eager to see them return.
That's Paris Thoma and Alexandros Charalambous from Chrysalis Leap talking about this year's Clean Tech
Climate Launchpad 2015.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Will they or won't they go back to Famagusta? There is a climate of hope, I think we could say, across both sides in Cyprus. And this week, the mayor of Famagusta, Alexis Galanos, who is also the president of the Union of Municipalities, hinted that he expected, perhaps, to go back sooner rather than later. What, Alexis, gave you that thought?
Well, what I really said is that I expected sooner or later movement on the question of Famagusta. And I elaborated, when I said movement, the appointment of United Nations experts to make a survey of the town. I will clarify again, the first part of the town, which in a way is in a very bad state. I added that there are 2 separate things. We should not expect to press a button and return to our town. That will take time for reconstruction. So people should not confuse movement of Famagusta, which will be the beginning of the end, and starting again a new town, which will take time. So that's exactly what I said, and I believe in that the Turkish side, particularly with Mr. Akinci as leader, who is a good man, I say that and I believe it, and he has a good chemistry with Mr. Anastasiadis, is sincere in going ahead with the talks, and both of them, they believe that things, 41 years are it's a long time, and they should proceed without delay for a settlement. Now, this is a general framework. As regards Famagusta, apart from the priority and the well-known things about Security Council resolutions and high-level agreements, etc., is a very important confidence-building measure. And either it goes with the general current on a very quick settlement in a few months' time or early 2016, so the question is irrelevant because we start with it, or there is a decision on the question of Famagusta soon that will also speed up the whole process. Therefore, my feeling, after having various meetings, is that Famagusta is inevitable to see movement. So I had to express it and give people a feeling of optimism, because they should feel optimistic. Part of the process of the talks and the successes of the talks, a part, of course, of the serious issues, is the human factor and the psychology. So we have to build the psychology, being optimistic, and being optimistic validly, not empty words. And I think that if you look at my history of so many years, all these years, 41 years, I was not I'm not famous for being optimistic or saying big things or promising big things. I was always very reserved. But now I feel optimistic that the question of Famagusta will see movement. And I explained what kind of movement I believe, but it's important movement. If you have a vision for the future.
And a lot of people are seeing that vision almost on a daily basis. You were, I think, earlier in the week at the Othello Tower. Now, the technical committee on the cultural heritage and so on has done a fantastic job in restoring that, and there are plans to move to the Armoury and the other gate and so on. How did you feel going along with so many people from both sides of the divide earlier this week to that musical evening in the ramparts of Famagusta?
Well, it was a magic evening, put it this way. It's a wonderful place. The medieval town of Famagusta is a diamond that belongs to the whole of Cyprus. Turkish Cypriots are the keepers of the keys, I say. And that's the truth. And you know, we haven't been to that part of the town for 50 years, since 1964. And I hope it will become a UNESCO monument. There is a lot of scope there to make it a very important place in Cyprus. So I felt well. I felt well, of course, you know, you always go back to places you lived with mixed feelings. But we have to overcome these sad feelings and look to the future for our children. One good thing of the 41 years is that they could help heal wounds.
And that was a very healing evening, I think, at the Othello Tower.
I was there also because my wife is part of the committee. And I would like very much to support Mrs. Vasiliou. And I advise her that not only must keep it up and continue, now that the iron, as they say in Greek, is hot, she should write to the president and ask for funds. There must be funds and personnel to help. They must make this committee an institution. They must give a permanence and not every time go around looking for funds or ideas. They must make it a permanent thing. Because in my view, it's not only cultural, it's also political. The cultural helps the political.
Well, that, I guess, is why so many groups now do seem to be getting together with similar groups on the other side, whichever side they happen to be, in order to use the arts, culture, music, and so many other things to try and bridge the gaps. Now, you did say earlier that you're not a natural optimist, but do you see all these smaller groups getting together suddenly as, in a sense, being a groundswell that is telling our politicians that 41 years is enough?
I think they will contribute to that. And I think that they are helping to build the momentum. But at the same time, we should not stay only with these cultural events. These cultural events must be, in a way, at the advance force. Political events and political decision must follow. Otherwise, it will be a vacuum. And the danger is that we'll only stay with the cultural, and then slowly, the political forces that they don't want a solution to get again in the game, because now they are not feeling so comfortable. So these cultural moves are there to help the political moves. So they have to combine together, and there must be a good timing on a computer, if you ask me. What is the objective? At least 65% yes from both sides on the referendum.
That is the Mayor of Famagusta, Alexis Galanos.
You can subscribe to the Cyprus News Digest on iTunes for free and get the program downloaded to your phone or tablet so you can listen anytime, anywhere.
It's a always good to have good news, and Cyprus apparently has improved its human trafficking record. It's been upgraded by the US State Department, according to an official at the US Embassy. Joining us on the Cyprus News Digest from MIGS, which is the Mediterranean Institute of Gender Studies, is Susanna Pavlou. Susanna, you must be pretty pleased with the new TIP, I think they call it, don't they, report?
Yeah. I mean, the government will be pleased. As an NGO, it's not our job to be pleased. As an NGO, our job is to be critical and to look at the gaps and to see where there is still room for improvement. And in terms of reports such as these, the TIP report, even though we do believe that it's a very good awareness-raising tool, I think it's in the past when things were particularly bad in Cyprus in terms of trafficking in human beings, and particularly sex trafficking, which is the issue that we've worked on more closely, it was a useful lobbying tool, so we could sort of wave it around and when we're lobbying our ministers and our MPs. But I think we need to keep in mind that this report is an external relations tool for the US government. We always have that sort of in the background, and I can explain more on that a little bit later. But we're pleased to see that, and this we knew, that there's more officers in the police anti-trafficking unit, which is really positive, and they're the body that they officially recognize trafficking victims. So what we see in the report
is that more victims have been identified.
Is that more victims have been identified, because in the past when we just don't have victims identified, someone would say, oh, that's great. That means we don't have trafficking. Well, in fact, no, we know that there is trafficking, so the fact that more victims are being identified is really positive. That means that the efforts that have been taken by the anti-trafficking unit with the police are really paying off, and so that's positive.
There are some other things in the report, for example, how we treat identified victims of trafficking, and that still seems to be somewhere we have a lot of improvements to make.
Yeah, and I would say across the board, it's not only on trafficking, across the board when we're talking about, violence against women, victims of violence, victims of domestic violence and so on. We do have an issue in Cyprus in terms of our protection and support system, okay? And for example, the report mentions, and this we knew because we have a lot of communication with other organizations that work directly in the field, that there have been issues over the years with the shelter and the services provided at the shelter. We've called it in the past more like a hostel rather than a shelter for trafficking victims. When you have a shelter for trafficking victims, you're looking at a comprehensive support system within that space which victims would have access to. We haven't had that in the past. Something that has improved is that they're not putting victims in hotel rooms or in rented apartments, which puts them particularly vulnerable to be found by their traffickers and so on. So that's good. But at the same time, we still have issues with the way they're treated by the social welfare services. We've heard this over and over again. There is a general problem with the social welfare services. There's a problem with how quickly they get their social benefits. It seems that there are huge delays with their social benefits.
And what happens in cases like that? Because if you've rescued somebody who's been trafficked, how do they live if they're not getting any welfare benefits? Particularly, some of them are, in a sense, asked to stay here to testify in court, and that can take a year or more.
It can take much longer than that, and that there have been huge delays in trials, in getting cases through the criminal justice system. And what happens is that the NGOs are footing the bill. NGOs such as KISA, Stop Trafficking Cyprus, Caritas, Stigma. These are organizations that work with victims and literally are footing the bill for them to live until they get their social welfare benefits. Another issue is our reintegration system. So, do we expect them to sit around for 2-3 years, or how long it's going to take for the case to go through the system? No. So the report does mention that they have access to training programs and so on, but we need them to reintegrate. They need to have access to employment, to quality employment.
Now, that's another issue, isn't it? Because another thing that came out of the report was that a lot of, not just victims of trafficking, but asylum seekers as well, who are vulnerable in a similar way, are
to exploitation.
given jobs which they're obliged to accept if they want to keep
Exactly.
any form of sort of welfare benefit.
Exactly. So,
and they're put into underpaid work. We don't seem to have any regulations in place to check that these people are being treated fairly, and it almost looks from a couple of the things in the report that we identify them and then we actually through our own system put them back into an exploitation situation.
Exactly as you describe it. What we found is that victims of trafficking, like all recipients of welfare benefits, whatever it's a public assistance or minimum income and so on, their benefits are tied to, I think it's called active integration or something ridiculous like that. Anyway, it's about people being on benefits, but at the same time encouraging them to find work so that they can be off benefits.
But if you put a trafficking victim
precisely.
into, for example, somebody's private house as a domestic servant...
So you can't throw everyone into the same sort of pot, right? These are women and men who are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, and not only that, have gone through extremely traumatic experiences. Okay, so the last thing in our minds you want to do is throw a victim of sex trafficking into a domestic work situation
where they potentially, we know, could again be sexually harassed, if nothing worse.
If nothing worse. I mean, in itself, I mean, this is another issue entirely, and I think we talked about it before. Domestic work isn't exploitative by its nature in Cyprus. Domestic work is exploitative. You know, in the best conditions, it is exploitative. And you're putting a victim of trafficking in that situation, in a private household, that cannot be inspected, okay, by the labour inspectors. So we don't know what's happening there. And she doesn't have access, right, to,
oversight, in a sense.
To oversight, but also to kind of civil integration into the wider society. If you're stuck in a household and you're sleeping, living, eating there, one would say, I mean, from another perspective, one would say, what better place for a victim to be, where she'll be looked after? But that, unfortunately, I mean, that ideally, that would be perfect, yeah? It's like being in a host family, yeah? But it's not like that. And really, we can't expect them to live on 300 or so euros a month, if they get that, okay? And how that helps them reintegrate, how that helps them reach their life. They're victims after all, you know.
Okay, very quickly, Susanna, because we're getting short of time now. Just what do you make of this report? How will it be used by the authorities here to try and improve our record? It needs improving, doesn't it?
Okay, I mean, overall, the report does identify areas where we have improved over the last years, but I have to put some criticism in the report. Keeping in mind that it's an external relations tool, and that's where my gripe is that I question how little emphasis they've put on prevention, how much emphasis is put onto prosecution and convictions, which, yes, is always good. We need that, we want that. But I question how little emphasis is put on prevention, how little emphasis is put on demand reduction, which, after all, the US government has stated that commercial sex is not compatible with reducing trafficking. So, for example, Cyprus is on Tier 2, where we have criminalized buying sexual services from victims of trafficking, whereas countries that have legalized prostitution, such as Austria and Germany, are on Tier 1. So we do question aspects such as that. I mean, we think that more emphasis needs to be on prevention, on demand reduction, particularly in the commercial sex industry. We also need to look at domestic work, how the system of domestic work in Cyprus is conducive to trafficking, is conducive to exploitation. We need to look at that as well. And that's how we can prevent trafficking. So we want to see identified victims being reduced, the number being reduced, but we want it to be for the right reasons, not because they're not doing their job, but because we're actually investing in prevention.
That's Susanna Pavlou from the Mediterranean Institute of Gender Studies talking there about the latest TIP, Trafficking in Persons report issued by the US Embassy. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.